Why, hello everyone. Welcome to week 2 of Jane Austen's Emma. Um, I think I've told you this before. Whatever book I'm reading or teaching is my favorite, and this is my favorite. I am so enjoying this. I hope you are too. Austen is so intelligent with her portraits of these people. I saw in one critic that people would write to her and say, "Oh my gosh, I know this person," because the characters are so realistic. Um, before we get into the text, and I'm just going to tell you, for the life of me, I can't figure out where we stopped, so I'm just going to wing it. I think I remember it being page 30, but I don't really know. But I'm going to talk to you first about some articles that I found. Actually, a lot of this Jane found for me. Jane found a ton of materials. There's so much about Jane Austen that I could probably teach the class in a whole semester. So much material. And I see an overall admiration for what she has done in her novels. In Henry James, you see an overall admiration. You see it in William Faulkner, you see it in George Eliot. But in this case, people feel, I think, feel that the material is relatable. And so there's a great affection for Austen and an admiration for the intelligence of her portraits. So I have this one article. It's entitled Jane Austen, the Novel and Social Realism. Some of the other materials I can't get to quite yet because what I don't want to do is spoil the end of it. It wouldn't be any fun at all. This is written by Catherine Sutherland, and she discusses number one, the use of social realism and her focus on the mundanity of everyday life. So we see that. I even showed you a picture last week of what would be served at a wealthy person's meal. Just an unbelievable amount of offerings. I mean, I don't know about you, but I might have a piece of cheese for lunch and then move on. But anyway, Professor Sutherland says she is feeding into the novel and suggesting that the new novel that she is carving out should be concerned with these social realistic issues. And this is new because the novel, as she finds it in the early 19th century, is full of extravagant plots, adventures, improbable incidents, and what she strips away is that improbability, concentrating instead on the lives of people rather like the rest of us. Again, that's what I'm seeing is that people can relate to her characterizations. Even though we don't live in England, we can still see the scenery, the setting, the 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 pathways. Um, and she's talking specifically about the middling classes and the gentry. In her own day, readers quickly realized that she was doing something new in the novel, and she gained a very respectable reputation as an ambitious novelist. Two further new ingredients that she brings to the novel are the interior space that she carves out for the heroine. We will see her thoughts, and we did see this in later novels, but Austen really developed this. We learn what Emma is thinking. Instead of her novels being a string of adventures that are enacted in the world outside, the psychic space of the heroine becomes increasingly important. In Emma, we find that we spend as much time inside the heroine as we do engaging with the events outside. So um, a little bit later, we'll see an argument she gets into with Mr. Knightley about Harriet, and we hear her thoughts. Um, She is quite remarkable, I think, in bringing something natural into the novel, and that's her contribution to the development of social realism at this time. Things that I've read. So, in another article by the same Professor Catherine Sutherland, do I know where she came from? I do not. She considers, Sutherland considers Jane Austen's portrayal of female characters and her harshly moralistic outlook. Um, we think of Jane Austen as a woman's novelist looking at the world from a woman's point of view, and that's pretty much true. Her heroines are witty, they're attractive, they're intelligent, they're articulate. Um, but we have to remember too that Austen can be a harsh moralist. They may be witty and independent in certain ways, but she doesn't allow them to pursue individual courses of behavior, and she doesn't encourage passion, and she doesn't encourage rebellion. In a bit, we will also see that Emma says that she has no intention of marrying. Um, and we know all about what that would mean for a young woman at the time, but she had means. The realities of Jane Austen's society are that women have much less freedom for experimentation than men, and I think that's the truth. It isn't so much that she doesn't allow women to explore, it's they don't have the ability to explore. They didn't have careers. They didn't have a chance to go to university. Their male contemporaries had both. Young men had the equivalent of a gap year. They went for the grand tour, often before they went to university, which was an opportunity for experiment with all aspects of life. Women had no chance to experiment. The rules were very strict for women of this class. In fact, where did my book go? In fact, we see that Emma is reluctant to walk alone into town because one just doesn't. Um, let's see, women had no chance to experiment. The rules were very strict for women of this class. Remember, we're talking about the middle classes and the gentry, that they must be virgins when they marry, and they must remain loyal to her husband, however foolish and indeed however corrupt he might be. Um, then I have another piece here. This, I don't know where this came from, but remember last week I mentioned something about how the one criticism foisted on Austen about, particularly this book, but in other books as well, that she doesn't address the contemporaneous events. But this critic addresses that, and I think it's really interesting. Um, among the many good critical tributes to the genius of Jane Austen, to the fine distinction of her humor, the sympathetic intimacy of her satire, the easy exactitude of her unpretentious style, which have appeared in celebration of her centenary, there is one criticism that is naturally recurrent: the remark that she was quite untouched by the towering politics of her time. This is intrinsically true. Nevertheless, it may easily be used to imply the reverse of the truth. It is true that Jane Austen did not attempt to teach any history or politics, but it is not true that we cannot learn any history or politics from Jane Austen. Any work so piercingly intelligent as Emma, of its own kind, especially any work of so wise and humane a kind, is sure to tell us much more than shallower studies covering a larger surface. I will not say much of the formality of of some of the conventions and conversational forms. For in such things it is not only certain that change is important, but it is not even certain that it is final. Um, let's see where. Essentially, what she says in quite a lot of a paragraph is that in this locale where Emma exists, they wouldn't know much about current events. It was an insulated world. And this author goes on to say, for all this that has happened since might well be called the evolution of Emma. I'm going to come back to that concept, the evolution of Emma. That is a phrase that appears quite a lot. It really speaks to essentially the education of Emma based on her behavior. That unique and formidable institution, the English lady, has indeed become much more of a public institution. That is, she has made the same mistakes on a much larger scale. The softer fastidiousness and finer pride of the more gracious 18th century heroine may seem to make her a shadow by comparison. It seems cruel to say that the breaking off, never mind, not going to say that, um, with a gentleness and justice and sympathy with good intentions, which clear her from the change of common cynicism. So we see that she's scheming, but she thinks her intentions are good. Um, the great novelist does find the spring of her heroine's errors in many of ours. The spring is a philanthropy. That spring is a philanthropy and even a generosity secretly founded on gentility, because she was a lady that acted as she did, and she thought she had a right to act as she did. She is the type in fiction of of a whole race of English ladies, in fact, for whom refinement is a religion. Her claim to oversee and order the social things about her consisted of being refined. She would not have admitted that being rich had anything to do with it, but as a fact, it had everything to do with it. If she had been very much richer, if she had had one of the great modern fortunes, if she had had the wider modern opportunities for the rich, she would have thought her duty to act on a wider modern scale. She would have had public spirit and political grasp. But she isn't one of those great fortunes. She would have dealt with, let's see, we don't need to say that. Mm. And we do not mean that the work is done entirely. Nope. Sorry, I keep trying not to give away the story because it's so good. It is noted that there are few traces of the French Revolution in Miss Austen's novels, but indeed there have been few traces of it in Miss Austen's country. That is the point. The peculiarity which has produced the situation I described is really this, that the new sentiment of humanitarianism has come, with the old sentiment of aristocracy has not gone. Social superiors have not really lost any old privileges, they have gained new privileges. In fact, and I hope to get to this today, at one point we see that Emma is participating in philanthropy by going to some poor people's houses in the region. It's her responsibility to service the poor. No revolution has shaken their secret security or menaced them with the awful peril of becoming no more than men. Therefore, their social reform is but their social refinement grown restless. And in this old teacup comedy can be found far more clearly appreciated than in any ambitious book about problems in politics. The psychology of this mere restlessness in the rich when it first stirred up upon its cushions. Jane Austen described a narrow class, but so truthfully that she has much to teach about it after adventures, where when it remained narrow as a class and broadened only as a sect. I think that's all I have in here. Yes. So I was glad to find that that little bit about um, there not being anything from revolutions or the like that penetrates this little community. But what Austen does supremely well is portray each of the characters in this gentry and their thoughts and motivations. So if we go to, I'm just going to wing it. I think that we stopped right around page 30. So I'll start with chapter 4. I could not figure this out. Um, which begins on page 28. I'm going to be going through this using quite a lot of the notes provided by this annotated Emma. It is excellent. It's annotated and edited by David M. Shepard, um, and I'm much enjoying it. So I will be giving you the benefit of a lot of this material. Um, if we go to page 26, the beginning of chapter 4, uh, let's see, if we go to the middle of the paragraph, she's talking about Harriet Smith's intimacy in Hartfield. Quick and decided in her ways, Emma lost no time in inviting, encouraging, and telling her to come very often. As their acquaintance increased, so did their satisfaction in each other. As a walking companion, Emma had very early foreseen how useful she might find her. So remember that Emma um, had a sister who married quite a number of years ago, and so Emma was the mistress of the home, and her only other real companion was her father, who is a bit namby-pamby, should we say, a little flaccid. A few lines later, uh, let's see. Her father never went beyond the shrubbery, where 2 divisions of the ground sufficed him for his long walk, or his short as the year varied. So we'll see him occasionally talking about his short walk or his long walk, depending on the weather. And since Mrs. Weston's marriage, her exercise had been too much confined. What Mrs. Weston, again, is the nanny who got married. And just a note, we're going to see Mr. Woodhouse, Emma's father, referred to poor Mrs. Weston or Isabella, or poor Mrs. Isabella, the um, older sister. And it's always this notion that marriage is a change, and Mr. Woodhouse does not like change. She had ventured once alone to the Randalls, but it was not pleasant. And that here's my note. Um, Emma would find it unpleasant because social norms discouraged women from walking alone, and she shows a great concern for social propriety. She also may simply dislike the lack of a companion. Both of those concepts there. So in the next paragraph, um, Harriet certainly was not clever, but she had a sweet, docile, grateful disposition. A few lines later, her early attachment to herself was very amiable, and her inclination for good company and power of appreciating what was elegant and clever shewed that there was no want of taste, though strength of understanding must not be expected, indicating that Harriet, mm, not the sharpest tool in the shed, I'm just going to say. Um, it is not clear how much genuine good taste or appreciation for elegance and good company Harriet actually manifests. What she mostly displays throughout the novel is an inclination to agree with others, and thus she's probably just echoing Emma's own opinion. That's something that's pretty noteworthy. You have to hang on to that because we'll see that over and over and over. Um, at the bottom of this page, Mrs. Weston was the object of a regard which had its basis in gratitude and esteem. So this is the nanny again. Harriet would be loved as one to whom she could be useful. For Mrs. Weston, there was nothing to be done. For Harriet, everything. In some ways, Emma's approach to Harriet reminds me of Pygmalion, doesn't it? How she's trying to mold her. And Harriet is descended from nobody, which means that she was born illegitimate. And that's why she's at Mrs. Goddard's, the school for girls or women. Um, and she's kind of the sort that Emma can begin afresh. She can add whatever ingredients she wants. If we look to the next page, 27, her first attempt at usefulness were in an endeavor to find out who were the parents, but Harriet could not tell. She was ready to tell everything in her power, but on this subject, questions were in vain. In other words, we don't know where she came from. Next paragraph. Where Oh, and we often get little insights into Harriet's immersion in this gentry world from which she is not descended. She has noticed that with much exultation of Mrs. Martin's having two parlors, two very good parlors indeed, one of them quite as large as Mrs. Goddard's drawing room. And parlor was a term for a small sitting or living room, such as would exist in more humble dwellings. A drawing room was a larger, more elegant room of this type, like the one at the Woodhouses. The Woodhouses, of course, are the richest people in the area. This is why Harriet makes a point of the size of one of the Martins' parlors. Two parlors, though not as good as the drawing rooms, would have been a source of distinction, for not any family with pretensions to more refined living would need at least two sitting rooms, one for daily activities of the family and one for guests. I think that's it reminds me of in some houses, especially not so much houses that were recently built, they have become more practical, but even if large, but it's like that living room that we have had. I I don't have a living room anymore because I downsized, but my other house did have a living room, and we didn't really use it that much, very often, only with the Christmas tree. I knew somebody who would never let anybody into her living room to mess up the vacuum cleaner lines. That was kind of squirrely, but I mean, we're all kind of familiar with this. Um, let's see. Down at the bottom of page 27, for some time she was amused without thinking beyond the immediate cause, but as she came to understand the family better, other feelings arose. She had taken up a wrong idea, fancying it was a mother and daughter, a son and a son's wife who lived together, but when it appeared that Mr. Martin, who bore a part in the narrative, was always mentioned with approbation for his great good nature in doing something or another, was a single man. And now we know what Emma's up to. Um, that there was no young Mrs. Martin, no wife in the case. She did suspect danger to her poor little friend from all this hospitality and kindness. On the next page 28. Uh, Mr. Martin, is a shepherd's son, and we learn that in the first large paragraph. He had his shepherd's son into the parlor one night on purpose to sing to her. She was very fond of singing. He could sing a little himself. She believed he was very clever and understood everything. He had a very fine flock, and while she was with them, he had been uh, he had been bid more for his wool than anybody in the country. So before Harriet becomes best buddies with Emma, she had stayed with the Martins. So she had the basis for comparison between the finery of the Woodhouse's house and the Martins, who are not as high on the social scale. Um, let's see. If we look on to the next page, oh, what is that one? 24. He reads I'm at the bottom of page 28 and over onto the top of the next page. He reads the agricultural reports and some other books. The agricultural reports were a series of surveys produced by the British Board of Agriculture. This period witnessed an increasing interest in agricultural improvements, with a number of authors writing books on different regions and aspects of farming in the hope of improving knowledge and encouraging better methods. This is, remember, at the beginning of the 1800s, and we are going to progress through the 1800s, and when we have done this in other books, into the Industrial Revolution. So things socially and culturally are progressing. Many such methods were implemented, and the resulting increase in food production played a critical role in the Industrial Revolution, which was beginning in England during this period. Isn't that interesting? I just was fascinated by that note. If we go over to page 29, this is 1, 2, 3 paragraphs down. A young farmer, it's second sentence in the next paragraph. A young farmer, whether on horseback or on foot, is the very last sort of person to raise my curiosity. So here we see Emma's kind of snobbery. He's beneath me. There's a lot of discussion of social class in this novel, but it gives us a really good picture of it. We've seen it in other novels, but it's very clear here. So the note about his being on foot, going on horseback, as Harriet said he did, would signal greater wealth, though not as much as someone's owning a carriage. By saying on horseback or on foot, Emma is associating him with those who are poorer. The yeomanry are precisely the order of people with whom I feel I can have nothing to do. The yeomanry were traditionally those who owned and farmed a small property. This placed them below gentlemen and above landless laborers. The term would also apply to others in the same middle rank in society, respectable but not genteel. English rural society was characterized by three principal classes: large landowners, who by this time possessed most of the land in England; farmers who rented considerable parcels from the first group, while sometimes also possessing small plots of their own, and sold what they produce; and laborers with no property. The Martins, despite being only or primarily renters, have been able to prosper and accumulate livestock and live fairly well. So we're getting a lot of background about characters who will play a role. But we need to know that about Martin and Emma's snobbery against him. Then, a number of paragraphs later, he's only 24. That is too young to settle, she says. Let's see. And then over onto page 30, she says that it's really, he should be 30 when he marries. Oh, page 30. But he should also be 30 years old. She's just making some observations about his worthiness. Next page. It's actually at the bottom of 30 or 29. The misfortune of your birth ought to make you particularly careful as to your associates. There can be no doubt of your being a gentleman's daughter. She just speculated that. She wants Harriet to take on the accoutrements of Emma's own gentry world, and the best way to do that is to surmise that Harriet was the child of a gentleman. And notice here too that Harriet, excuse me, Emma refers to Harriet as Harriet, while Harriet calls her Miss Woodhouse. That's throughout the novel. This asymmetry will persist, a testament to Emma's social superiority. Harriet will never challenge or question it, and Emma will never think of altering it by permitting Harriet to call her by her first name, as she could do. Just a little tidbit about the class. Emma goes on next paragraph to say, I want to see you permanently well connected, and to that end, it will be advisable to have as few odd acquaintances as may be. She is dissuading Harriet from um, associating with Martin. So a note about Harriet, the abandoned or disinherited child who turns out to be the son or daughter of a wealthy man, was a common fictional convention. Oh, Dickens. The novels cited by Harriet um, are the novels stated above by Harriet are common in this fictional convention. Um, Another is the title character in what was probably the most renowned of all 18th century novels, Henry Fielding's Tom Jones. Definitely an English convention. Then if we fly on over to page 31, paragraph is this? I think it's the end of the second paragraph. Um, the young man had been the first admirer, but she trusted there was no other hold, and that there would be no serious difficulty on Harriet's side to oppose any friendly arrangement of her own. And we see her scheming. She's thinking about it. Emma is thinking about it. Um, um, so we assess Mr. Martin. Harriet was not insensible of his manner. She had voluntarily noticed her father's gentleness with admiration as well as wonder. Mr. Martin looked as if he did not know what manner was. So assessing Mr. Martin. Just by his appearance, we know he's a farmer, but we also know that he is prosperous. Page 32. He's very plain, undoubtedly, remarkably plain, but that is nothing compared to his entire want of gentility. He is, she says he's clownish, in other words, rough, and so totally without air or style. Mid-page. I kind of lost my place. Oh, certainly he is not like Mr. Knightley. He has not such a fine air and way of walking as Mr. Knightley. I see the difference plain enough, but Mr. Knightley is so very fine a man. I think I mentioned this last week. His name is indicative of maybe some connotation of knightliness. He really does represent the best of Englishmen. Mr. Knightley's air is so remarkably good. And then if we look at the bottom of this page, Mr. Martin is now awkward and abrupt. What will he be at Mr. Weston's time of life? There is no saying, indeed, replied Harriet rather solemnly. We're going to see Harriet parrot Emma's thoughts in what she thinks and in what she wants to perceive what Emma is conveying to her. But there may be pretty good guessing. He will be a completely gross, vulgar farmer, totally inattentive to appearances, thinking of nothing but profit and loss. A bit puzzling to make such a generalization, but then we go over to page 33. I'm 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs down. He seems to me to be grown particularly gentle of late. And she's talking about Mr. Elton, his behavior toward Emma and Harriet, which will be shortly on full display. So Elton makes an appearance, or at least they're talking about him. I do not know whether he has any design of ingratiating himself with either of us, Harriet, by additional softness, but it strikes me that his manners are softer than they used to be. That's a hint. That's foreshadowing. But we don't exactly know of what yet. She then repeated some warm personal praise which she had drawn from Mr. Elton. And this is my note, subsequent conversations will show her drawing praise of Harriet from Mr. Elton. So she's drawing it out of him, almost fishing for it. Her need to solicit never solicit it never makes her doubt her assumption that Harry is the one he seeks and courts. But we know otherwise if you've gotten further in. Mr. Elton was the very person fixed on by Emma for driving the young farmer out of Harriet's head. Wow. Um, we can see this cause effect playing out in Emma's brain, that she wants to remake Harriet. She must not associate with even successful farmers. Emma has now defined Harriet as probably coming from a gentleman, and she's going to use Elton and make a match to drive the farmer out of her head. What page am I on? Page 34. The longer she considered it, the greater was her sense of expediency. Mr. Elton's situation was most suitable, quite the gentleman himself, and without low connections. At the same time, not of any family that could fairly object to the doubtful birth of Harriet. And this is another note that I liked. A later passage suggests that Mr. Elton has some family links with trade, though the exact nature of it is never specified. This would put his family on a lower level than truly genteel ones, such as the Knightleys and the Woodhouses. This is why, in Emma's mind, that they could have no objection to Harriet. And of course, the objection is that she's likely illegitimate. At the bottom of, I keep forgetting my page number, page 34. He was reckoned very handsome, his person much admired in general, though not by her, there being a want of elegance of feature which she could not dispense with. But the girl who could be gratified by a Robert Martin's riding about the country to get walnuts for her might very well be conquered by Mr. Elton's admiration. That's her reasoning. If we go on to chapter 5, which is page 35, let's see. I do not know what your opinion may be, Mrs. Weston, said Mr. Knightley, of this great intimacy between Emma and Harriet Smith, but I think it's a bad thing. And this comes out later, too, that Knightley does not like this relationship. He doesn't know what Emma is up to. And if we, I have this note, this chapter is the only one in the novel in which Emma is absent. So that's notable. It still centers around her, for she is the sole subject of the exchange that comprises it, but now, instead of seeing her presented through action and speech, or through authorial commentary, we hear the two people who know and understand her best offer their evaluations, thereby providing an additional perspective. So the two people who know her best, Mrs. Weston, of course, is the governess, and Mr. Knightley. And Mr. Knightley admires Emma's intelligence. So this to him seems like maybe not suitable. This is the only time Jane Austen ever uses such a technique on this scale for a main character. One probable reason is that Emma is the most flawed of all these characters, which makes those who know and love her more likely to criticize or worry about her. Another is that she is arguably the most complex and multifaceted of all Austen heroines, which makes her especially suited to being exhaustively examined and presented from a variety of perspectives. Isn't that interesting? Austen uses a variety of techniques to display Emma. She says, Mrs. Weston says, a bad thing? Do you really think it a bad thing? Why so? I think they will neither of them do the other any good. You surprise me. Emma must do Harriet good, by supplying her with a new object of interest, Harriet may be said to do Emma good. Okay, so that kind of makes sense. I just have to hold my That's what phones are good for, when you have to hold your book open because they're so heavy. Towards the bottom of page 35, I can imagine your objection to Harriet Smith. She is not the superior young woman which Emma's friends ought to be. But on the other hand, as Emma wants to see her better informed, it will be an inducement to her to read more herself. They will read together. She means it, I know. Um, the hero of Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy, this is my note, declares that the highest mark of an accomplished woman is the improvement of her mind through extensive reading. This opinion was also expressed by those writing at the time on female education and conduct. Many such writers would offer detailed suggestions on the type of books that should be chosen. Mr. Knightley is later described as being a frequent reader himself. Um, and we'll see this in a little bit. I was going to tell you something. Oh, we'll get to more information about the education of women at this time, and many of my notes make reference to it. Many of the articles make reference to it, and as I've already said, that phrase, "the evolution of Emma," is partly her education, not perhaps a formal kind of education, but her education and perhaps her humanity. Page 36. Um, let's see. But I have done with expecting any course of steady reading from Emma. That's an interesting insight. She will never submit to anything requiring industry and patience and a subjection of the fancy to the understanding. That's a really important point. We're going to see, I can't remember where it is. It's coming though, that she begins books and then puts them aside and thinks she'll come back to it. And Harriet is not as intelligent as Emma, and she does something similar or even more superficially. Emma, in the next paragraph, is spoiled by being the cleverest of her family. We know that. At 10 years old, she had the misfortune of being able to answer questions which puzzled her sister at 17. This suggests that the sisters are 7 years apart and that Isabella married at 19. Okay, so down at the bottom of this page, he said, Mr. Knightley says, "Yes," he said, smiling, "you are better placed here. Very fit for a wife, but not at all for a governess." He's still talking to Isabella. Not Isabella, the nanny, Mrs. Weston. So many characters, I get them mixed up. "You might not give Emma such a complete education as your powers would seem to promise, but you were receiving a very good education from her on the very material matrimonial point of submitting your own will and doing as you were bid." So, having been governess to Emma, provided her with the kind of education she needed in order to become the mistress of her own house. This is my note, prevailing views of marriage stress the primacy of the husband and the need for a wife to submit her will. Oh, golly, we've seen that. At the same time, husbands were encouraged to consult their wives and respect their opinions. Other sources, as well as Austen's novels, indicate that in most marriages there were mutual, even if not completely equal, give and take. So Mr. Knightley's words probably include some deliberate exaggeration. His words about the education of Mrs. Weston at being the governess in the household for Woodhouses. On page 37, let's see. "I hope not that. It is not likely. No, Mr. Knightley, do not foretell vexation from that quarter. No, not I, indeed. I only name possibilities. I do not pretend to Emma's genius for foretelling and guessing. He doesn't like this matchmaking thing that she's into. But Harriet Smith, I have not half done about Harriet Smith. I think her the very worst sort of companion that Emma could possibly have. Mr. Knightley is often a truth speaker, so we have to listen to what he says. He's mature, he's wise, so he gives us a really good point of view here. He knows nothing herself and looks upon Emma as knowing everything. She is a flatterer in all her ways, and so much the worse because undesigned. Her ignorance is hourly flattery. Yikes. It's not a good point. At the end of the same paragraph, I am much mistaken if Emma's doctrines give any strength of mind or tend at all to make a girl adapt herself rationally to the varieties of her situation in life. They only give a little polish. That's this elevating, the concept of elevating Harriet. Let's see. So Mr. Knightley says at the bottom of page, no, it's at the top of 38. I do not know what I could imagining or what I could imagine, but I confess that I have seldom seen a face or figure more pleasing to me than hers. But I am a partial old friend. Mr. Knightley's words contrast him to Emma, whose imagination roams and shapes her actions so powerfully. And there's a lack of maturity in Emma and her need to mold Harriet. And it isn't necessarily to provide any good for Harriet. It's that Emma likes to do this. She likes to make these plots and schemes. Let's see. There's a picture here that's kind of funny. Remember, I just said that Emma is often distracted from her novels. And here's a picture of a woman being distracted from her reading. I'm looking at this annotated version, and the author has included a lot of illustrations. If we go to page 89, not 89, I can't read, 39, Mr. Knightley says, not at all, cried he. I am much obliged to you for it. It is very good advice, and it shall have a better fate than your advice has often found, for it shall be attended to. Mrs. John Knightley is easily alarmed and might be unhappy about her sister. Mrs. John Knightley is Emma's sister, Isabella, who is married to our Mr. Knightley's brother, which is why he's referred to as Mrs. John Knightley. Apparently, so you don't get people mixed up. Well, not us. This is the way it was done at the time. What does my notes say here? I don't have any. Next paragraph. I should like to see Emma in love and in some doubt of a return. It would do her good. But there is nobody hereabouts to attach her, and she goes so seldom from home. In other words, there's not really many prospects for an intelligent girl. There does indeed seem as little to tempt her to break her resolution at present, said Mrs. Weston, as can well be. And while she is so happy at Hartfield, I cannot wish her to be forming any attachment which would be creating such difficulties on poor Mr. Woodhouse's account. Mr. Woodhouse is very dependent on Emma, and we will see that Emma is a good caretaker. She often guides Mr. Woodhouse's response to situations, but she also is kind to him. He goes on to say, I do not recommend matrimony at present to Emma, though I mean no slight to the state, I assure you. Part of her meaning, that was Mrs. Weston. Part of her meaning was to conceal some favorite thoughts of her own and Mr. Weston's on the subject as much as possible. There were wishes at Randall's respecting Emma's destiny, but it was not desirable to have them suspected. in the quiet transition which Mr. Knightley soon afterwards made to "What does Weston think of the weather? Shall we have rain?" That was you'll see this quite a bit. There are a number of closures to conversations with a reference to rain or the weather, and it's because they live in a rural area and are guided by the weather. And for us, we're guided by the weather too, but we can go to the top of our computer screens, right up, this is where mine is, and look at the weather. And if it's going to rain this afternoon, I know that I have to cut my lawn this morning. But they didn't have such insight. So they close the conversation with a reference to the weather. And we go to chapter 6, which is page 41. I'm going to have to speed things up a little bit. It's just so hard to speed things up because everything is so interesting. So chapter 6. Emma could not feel a doubt of having given Harriet's fancy a proper direction and raised the gratitude of her young vanity to a very good purpose. Her vanity is Emma's vanity. And remember that she's the spoiled daughter of the richest man in the area. For she found her decidedly more sensible than before of Mr. Elton's being a remarkably handsome man with most agreeable manners. And as she had no hesitation in following up the assurance of his admiration by agreeable hints, she was soon pretty confident of creating as much liking on Harriet's side as there could be any occasion for. So we're going to see that Emma really misreads a lot of the signals that are coming to her, and she wants to see in situations what she believes she wants to see. Let's see, next paragraph. "You have given Miss Smith all that she required," said he. "You have made her graceful and easy. She was a beautiful creature when she came to you, but in my opinion, the attractions you have added are infinitely superior to what she received from nature." So, 2 paragraphs later, "If it were admissible to contradict a lady," said the gallant Mr. Elton. This is a note, and Mr. Elton abides by this tradition quite a lot. "Ideals for male courtesy and gallantry counseled against saying anything unpleasant or contrary to a lady. Such a course was far from universally practiced. Mr. Knightley shows himself consistently willing to contradict and criticize women, including Emma. But Mr. Elton is devoted to such gallantry, especially toward Emma. His insistence that Emma's contributions to Harriet's attractions exceed Harriet's own represents a significant hint of his real feelings, a hint that Emma ignores." He's going to be clearer about this, that Emma may have elevated Harriet beyond her station, which is a problem because anybody to whom she becomes attached may have a family that objects to her illegitimacy. Down at the bottom of page 41, "I have perhaps given her a little more decision of character, have taught her to think on points which had not fallen in her way before." Exactly so, says Elton. Pay attention to that phrase, because my note says, exactly so soon proves to be Mr. Elton's favorite expression. The use of such pet phrases is generally a sign of faults of characters in Austen's novels. Pet phrases. Top of page 42. "Great has been the pleasure, I am sure. I never met with a disposition more truly amiable." Go to, let's see, we're on 42, a couple of paragraphs down. "What an exquisite possession a good picture of her would be." This picture becomes important. "I would give any money for it. I almost long to attempt her likeness myself. You do not know I dare say, but 2 or 3 years ago I had a great passion for taking likenesses or painting portraits, and attempted several of my friends, and was thought to have a tolerable eye in general. But from one cause or another, I gave it up in disgust. Emma giving it up confirms that what Mr. Knightley said in the last chapter, that Emma will never submit to anything requiring industry and patience. Then there's a note here. Drawing and painting were among the most popular and highly regarded of female accomplishments at this time. A book from 1829. Oh, wait, I need to read that. Girls were frequently taught to draw and encouraged to continue the pursuit in later years. Austen's sister Cassandra drew and left the only portraits of Jane that are known for certain to be of her. So we will see the women involved in needlework too. That way, I'm going to see in a couple of pages. Landscapes had long been leading types of painting, and in the early 19th century, under the influence of Romanticism, they enjoyed particular popularity. The two greatest British painters of this period, J.M.W. Turner and John Constable, focused almost entirely on landscapes. I think it's interesting this reference to Turner because my mentor in graduate school was also an expert in Turner. He loved Turner. Just, there's a fun fact to know and tell. So she talks about her landscapes and about painting flowers. Yes, good man, thought Emma. This is interesting. We see Emma's thinking. Yes, good men, thought Emma, but what has all that to do with taking likenesses? We see her interior. You know nothing of drawing. Don't pretend to be in raptures about mine. She's kind of condescending about him. Mr. Elton's excessive rapture reveals his lack of discerning taste and his inclination towards flattery of Emma. We're getting all these hints, and yet we also are obliged to follow Emma's point of view. Her passing over the point reveals her neglect at attending to his true character and intentions. We don't know what his intentions are yet, but we're beginning to suspect it. On page 43, second paragraph, did not you observe her manners of answering me? How completely it meant, why should my picture be drawn? So here's Emma. She's going to draw a likeness of, she's going to paint a picture of Harriet. And Emma has just praised Harriet for her artlessness and now tries to draw attention to her admirable lack of vanity. See how she's underscoring all of Harriet's good qualities? Mr. Elton's reply, however, focuses only on the practical question of how easily Harriet's unwillingness can be overcome. At the top of page 43. Oh, yes, I observed it, I assure you. It was not lost on me, but still I cannot imagine she would not be persuaded. Oh, so Harriet is malleable. She'll pretty much do anything that Emma wants her to do. Harriet was soon back again, and the proposal almost immediately made, and she had no scruples which could stand many minutes against earnest pressing of both the others. Emma wished to go to work directly and therefore produced the portfolio containing her various attempts at portraits, for not one of them had ever been finished. Go back to that note about what Mr. Knightley says of her lacking industry. A few lines later, she had always wanted to do everything and had made more progress both in drawing and music than many might have done with so little labor as she would ever submit to. So this is a note, Emma's being able to draw and to play music. She's later depicted playing the piano, the most popular instrument of the time, indicates that she is talented and that she has benefited from a good education. It was more typical for ladies to have developed only one of these accomplishments. So this is a good characteristic in Emma, but she doesn't stick to anything. I don't know if you've ever known people like this, but here I am relating to these characters that I've I have students in the jail who we call minimalists. They do the absolute bare minimum. Oh, actually, I have people like that in my college classes too. Oh, it's so hard. But Emma passes over things quickly too. Um, then we go over onto page 44. Let's see. There's not much that I wanted to underscore here. Oh, there is a reference to my brother, but we'll see this throughout the novel. The characters frequently referred to their brothers-in-law as my brother. And my note tells me the usage is found throughout Jane Austen. One reason for this is the virtual permanence of ties by marriage, since divorce was almost unknown. Remember, I read you that release from the Gilded Cage about the only way in the United States to get a divorce was to migrate on over to out west. Um, if we go to page 45, we're going to see the interior of Harriet again. I really hope I'm not hearing the Amazon truck. The sitting began, and Harriet, smiling and blushing and afraid of not keeping her attitude or her posture and countenance, presented a very sweet mixture of youthful expression to the steady eyes of the artist. But there was no doing anything with Mr. Elton fidgeting behind her and watching every touch. There's Mr. Elton. She gave him credit for stationing himself where he might gaze and gaze again without offense, but was really obliged to put an end to it and request him to place himself elsewhere. It then occurred to her to employ him in reading. We, Austen keeps dropping hints about Elton and his real role in this relationship between the two girls, but we won't know that yet. At the end of the next paragraph, there was no being displeased with such an encourager, for his admiration made him discern a likeness almost before it was possible. She could not respect his eye, but his love and his compliance were unexceptional. That means that, in other words, his admiring Emma's skill is greater than his admiring Harriet's face. Poor Harriet. Next paragraph. There was no want of likeness. She had been fortunate in the attitude, and as she meant to throw in a little improvement to the figure to give a little more height and considerably more elegance. So, my note says, thus Emma values matchmaking over artistic accuracy. Her choice is emblematic of her preference for imagination over reality, as well as her larger scheme of making Harriet what she is not. Oh, I thought that was very telling. This is going to be it's going to flip on over to page 46, a standing memorial of the beauty of one, the skill of the other, and the friendship of both, with as many other agreeable associations as Mr. Elton's very promising attachment was likely to add. That's what Emma thinks, that she's going to make this portrait, and then Mr. Elton is going to see that he must care for Harriet. At the top of page, I forgot my page number, 46. Miss Woodhouse has given her friend the only beauty she wanted, observed Mrs. Weston to him. So she's kind of critical of the painting, not in the least suspecting that she was addressing a lover. The expression of the eye is most correct, but Miss Smith has not those eyebrows and eyelashes. It is the fault of her face that she has them not. So we see that Emma is kind of tinkering with Harriet's beauty. And Mr. Knightley says, "You have made her too tall, Emma." Mr. Knightley, like Mrs. Weston, has noticed Emma's alterations from Harriet's actual appearance, though he, unlike Mrs. Weston, makes no attempt to apologize for them. And here interjects Mr. Elton. Oh no, certainly not too tall, not in the least too tall. Consider she is sitting down, which naturally presents a different, which in short gives exactly the idea, and the proportions must be preserved, you know. Proportions, foreshortening. And the note on this said foreshortening is an artistic technique discussed in books of the time, in which an object is shortened in a particular direction in order to make it appear more natural or to give it greater depth or solidity. If Emma had used such a technique, and there's nothing to indicate she has, it would have made Harriet appear rather shorter than taller. Mr. Elton, a little insight into Elton, is just using technical artistic terms that he has presumably heard without understanding of what they actually mean. It's kind of like in my writing classes where I tell students, don't string together a whole bunch of words that you've pulled out of this source. You have to know what the word means. They say, okay, and they do it anyway. Page 47. Here's Papa, Mr. Woodhouse. But, my dear Papa, it is supposed to be summer, a warm day in summer. Look at that tree. But, as always, Woodhouse worries about his health. But it is never safe to sit out of doors, my dear. Um, always worried about the potential impact on his health. And then at the top of page 47, it's a few paragraphs down, let's see, it was December, and Mr. Woodhouse could not bear the idea of her stirring out of the house in the fogs of December. This is really indicative of this period of time. My note says London had long been notorious for fogs because of the smoke emitted by coal burned for fuel. We're still experiencing the effects of that from the 1800s. The increase in population, the latest census in 1811 had shown London, containing approximately 1 million people, had gradually made the problem worse. It continued to worsen into the Victorian period before eventually diminishing in the second half of the 20th century. The fog was at its worst in the winter when people burned the most coal for heating. And remember, in Oliver Twist, what we have are chimney sweeps. And that was necessary because of these coal burning fires. Down at a little bit later on the top of page 48, this man is almost too gallant to be in love. Thought Emma. Here's her thoughts. That's why I pointed this out. I should say so, but that I suppose there may be 100 different ways of being in love. He is an excellent young man and will suit Harriet exactly. It will be an exactly so moment, as he says himself. But this is her thoughts. But he does sigh and languish and study for compliments rather more than I could endure as principal. I come in for a pretty good share as a second, but it is his gratitude on Harriet's account. Emma is thoroughly misunderstanding Elton. And we go into the next chapter, chapter 7. So again, we meet Mr. Martin. Mr. Martin has sent over a proposal of marriage to Harriet. And he wrote as if he really loved her very much. Very telling detail. But she did not know. And so she was come as fast as she could to ask Miss Woodhouse what she should do. Emma was half ashamed of her friend for seeming so pleased and so doubtful. But that's a telling detail, isn't it? Because Harriet doesn't know what to do. She doesn't really even know what she feels about Martin. Down towards the bottom of this page, Emma was not sorry to be pressed. She read and was surprised. The style of the letter was much above her expectation. There were not merely no grammatical errors, but as a composition it would not have disgraced a gentleman. The language, though plain, was strong and unaffected, and the sentiment it conveyed very much to the credit of the writer. It was short, but expressed good sense, warm attachment, liberality, propriety, and even delicacy of feeling. One of my notes says that um, something that was often valued in writing, we'll see this in a little bit, was to be succinct, get to the point. Don't go on with the kind of excessive drivel that you can get if you're looking up everything in a thesaurus. Uh, is it a good letter or is it too short? Asks Harriet. Yes, indeed, a very good letter, said Emma rather slowly. So good a letter, Harriet, that everything considered, I think one of his sisters must have helped him. I can hardly imagine the young man whom I saw talking with you the other day could express himself so well, if left quite to his own powers, and yet it is not the style of a woman. No, certainly. It is too strong and concise, not diffuse enough for a woman. No doubt he is a sensible man, and I suppose may have a natural talent for, thinks strongly and clearly, and when he takes a pen in hand, his thoughts naturally find a proper words. It was so with some men. Yes, I understand the sort of mind, vigorous, decided, in sentiments, to a certain point, not coarse. A better written letter, Harriet, returning it, than I had expected. So now we're going to have to see Emma figure out how to disassociate the good qualities um, from Mr. Martin. And she's able to do that. But let's see, Harriet says, "You think I ought to refuse him?" said Harriet, looking down. Oh, that's telling. Ought to refuse him? My dear Harriet, what do you mean? Oh, here it is. This is the note that I was looking for. A contemporary book expressed an ideal of letter writing that conforms closely to the letter being described. It urges the writer to be unaffected and express your meaning as freely, frankly, plainly as possible. On page 51, at the top, I shall not give you any advice, Harriet. I will have nothing to do with it. This is a point which you must settle with your own feelings. Do you ever remember reading The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, where he begins, the I speaker begins by saying, I am not mad? Anytime anybody says, I am not mad, you better think twice. That person probably is. And this is Harriet doing the same exact thing. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You must settle your own feelings. End of the next paragraph, but do not imagine that I want to influence you. 2 paragraphs later. Not for the world, said Emma, smiling graciously. Would I advise you either way? Isn't that hilarious? Top of 52. Miss Woodhouse, as you will not give me your opinion, I must do as well as I can by myself, and I have now quite determined and really almost made up my mind to refuse Mr. Martin. Do you think I am right? Oh, poor Harriet. Just doesn't know what to do. Perfectly right, my dearest Harriet. You are doing just what you ought. While you are at all in suspense, I kept my feelings to myself, but now that you are so completely decided, I have no hesitation in improving. That's like the fourth time she says, I'm not going to influence you. While you were in the smallest degree wavering, I said nothing about it because I would not influence. Fifth time. I could not have visited Mrs. Robert Martin of Abbey Mill Farm. Wow. So much of this is selfish. This is my note, the hierarchical principles governing this society dictated that one keep close friendships and company only with those of the same social rank. All of the characters in this novel and other Austen novels follow this rule to a large extent, and Emma shows herself to be more particular about it than most. So, if Harriet marries, well, we don't know if it's down or lateral, we don't know, but if she marries this farmer, what's her name? Emma is going to keep her distance. Dear affectionate creature at the top of 53. You banished to Abbey Mill Farm, you confined to the society of the illiterate and vulgar all your life. There's nothing to say that Martin is illiterate or vulgar. In fact, he shows himself to be the opposite in the quality of that letter. Emma is condemning Martin more than is warranted. And then at the top of page 54, this letter, however, was written and sealed and sent. The business was finished. Harriet was it. So they sent the letter with Harriet declining. She was rather low all the evening. Oh, poor Harriet. Not that big of a thinker, but, we suspect that maybe she really liked Martin. But Emma could allow for her amiable regrets and sometimes relieve them by speaking of her own affection, sometimes by bringing forward the idea of Mr. Elton. She just can't push it any harder, can she? Next page, 54. Oh, I'm still on 54. One should be sorry to see greater pride or refinement in the teacher of a school, Harriet. This is Mrs. Goddard. Emma articulates a typical opinion then, namely that the maintenance of the social hierarchy was served by people in humble stations not being too refined or not too proud, since that would make them discontented and less apt to fulfill the place they held. So that echoes what Mr. Knightley has already indicated, that Emma may have done a disservice to Harriet in giving her these airs or familiarizing her with this gentry world. The idea of Mr. Elton was certainly cheering, but still, after a time, she was tender-hearted again towards the rejected Mr. Martin. And we suspect again that, did you see one of my dogs just run past there? If I'm lucky, I'll get through a whole lecture without the UPS guy coming. And I know he's coming because I ordered a bag of dog food. It's much better to order it on Amazon, I'm just going to say, rather than hauling a 40-pound bag of dog food to the car. I'm on page 55. That's a fun fact to know and tell. How cheerful, how animated, how suspicious, how busy their imaginations are. This final reference to their animation, I cannot say that word, imaginations is appropriate for Emma in envisioning this entire elaborate scenario revolving around people that she has mostly never met, is displaying her own highly active imagination. So, she was condemning these people that she never met. She has really foisted upon Martin a great deal of negative characteristics, to be vulgar and illiterate, but he's not. He doesn't show that. Chapter 8 is an interesting chapter because there's much in this chapter about social class. Second paragraph. Mr. Knightley, who had nothing of ceremony about him, was offering, by his short, decided answers, an amusing contrast to the protracted apologies and civil hesitations of the other. And then we have Mr. Woodhouse at the end of the next paragraph. He's speaking in the next paragraph, and he says, "We invalids think we are a privileged people." Who calls himself an invalid? Only people who focus on that. And therefore, I think I will beg your excuse and take my 3 turns, my winter walk. Remember, that's the shorter walk. You probably know people like that, and I think this is what makes Austen such a fine reading, because you get characters with whom you can identify. Mr. Woodhouse, at the top of page 57, at last was off, but Mr. Knightley, instead of being immediately off, likewise sat down again, seemingly inclined for more chat. He began speaking of Harriet, and speaking of her with more voluntary praise than Emma had ever heard before. A few lines later, "Come," said he, "you are anxious for a compliment, so I will tell you that you have improved her. You have cured her of her schoolgirl giggle. She really does you credit." Thank you. I should be mortified indeed if I did not believe I had been of some use, but it is not everybody who will bestow praise where they may. You do not often overpower me with it. So he's warming up to something, we can see. Um, down at the, or let's see, top of page 58. I have good reason to believe your little friend will soon hear of something to her advantage. Indeed. How so? Of what sort? A very serious sort. It said Mr. Knightley. Emma was more than half in hopes of Mr. Elton's having dropped a hint. Mr. Knightley was a sort of general friend and adviser, and she knew Mr. Elton looked up to him. So Knightley does act with wisdom and intelligence. And so he's dropping hints about something happening positive for Miss Harriet. He is, let's see, Robert Martin is the man. Uh-oh, we already know about this. He is desperately in love and means to marry her. Oh, so it seems as if Martin and Harriet do have an affinity, an affection for each other. Next paragraph. He knows I have a thorough regard for him and all his family, and I believe considers me as one of his best friends. So my note says that we use this term now, best friends, as your bestie, but in this case, Martin is still at a different level than Knightley, but comes to him for advice. Okay. I never hear better sense from anyone but Robert Martin. He always speaks to the purpose, open, straightforward, and very well judging. So he's really talking Mr. Martin up. Next line, he is an excellent young man, both son and brother. I had no hesitation in advising him to marry. He proved to me that he could afford it, and that being the case, I am convinced he could not do better. I praised the fair lady too, and although sent him away very happy. My note says, Mr. Knightley's procedure here contrasts with Emma's procedure with Harriet, for Mr. Knightley concentrates on practical matters that he can speak of knowledgeably, like that he can afford the marriage, and does not try to sway the other person's affections, even though, as he soon indicates, he does not have a high opinion of the lady in question, Harriet. Um, Down at the bottom of the same paragraph. This happened the night before last. Now, as we may fairly suppose, he would now not allow much time to pass before he spoke to the lady, and as he does not appear to have spoken yesterday, it is not unlikely that he should be at Mrs. Goddard's today. Mrs. Goddard's at that's the school. Pray, Mr. Knightley, says Emma, who had been smiling to herself through a great part of this speech. How do you know Mr. Knightley didn't already speak yesterday? You think she wins? Top of the next page. Oh no, this is middle 58. Then this was obliged to be repeated before it could be believed, and Mr. Knightley actually looked red with surprise and displeasure as he stood up in tall indignation and said, "Then she is a greater simpleton than I ever believed her. What is the foolish girl about?" "Oh, to be sure," cried Emma. "It's always incomprehensible to a man that a woman should ever refuse an offer of marriage. A man always imagines a woman to be ready for anybody who asks her." "Nonsense," he says. "A man does not imagine any such thing. But what is the meaning of this? Harriet Smith refuse Robert Martin? Madness, if it is so, but I hope you are mistaken." So he speaks the truth. We see this repeatedly. And it is madness for Harriet to refuse Martin, because Martin isn't considering the circumstances of her birth. It is not relevant. You saw her answer. You wrote her answer too, Emma. This is your doing. You persuaded her to refuse. "And if I did," she says, which, however, I am far from allowing, "I should not feel that I had done wrong. Mr. Martin is a very respectable young man, but I cannot admit him to be Harriet's equal." "Not Harriet's equal!" exclaimed Knightley, loudly and warmly, and with calmer asperity, added a few moments afterwards, "No, he is not her equal indeed, for he is as much her superior in sense as in situation. Emma, your infatuation about that girl blinds you." Yes, that's the point. Martin would have elevated Harriet to legitimacy. And she goes on. She is no. This is Knightley. She is known only as a parlor boarder at a common school. She is not a sensible girl, not a girl of any information. Any information means education. She has been taught nothing useful, and she is too young and too simple to have acquired anything herself. Yikes. Page 60. I felt that as to fortune, in all probability, he might do much better. This is Knightley saying this um, about the match. He could not do worse, in other words. And at the end of this paragraph, even Emma, with all her partiality for Harriet, will think this is a good match. It was a good match. And at the top of page 61, a degradation to illegitimacy and ignorance to be married to a respectable, intelligent gentleman farmer. Yeah, that's Harriet's loss. And at the end of page 61, till you chose to turn her into a friend, her mind had no distaste for her own set, nor any ambition beyond it. He's really astute. He goes on, Robert Martin would never have proceeded so far if he had not felt persuaded of her not being disinclined to him. I know him well. He has too much real feeling to address any woman on the haphazard, selfish passion. And as to conceit, he is the farthest from it of any man I know. Depend upon it, he had encouragement from Harriet. Page 62. Let's see. Oh, no, I mean, middle of page 62. Upon my word, Emma, to hear you abusing the reason you have is almost enough to make me think so too. Better be without sense than misapply it as you do. He really calls her on this. Next paragraph. Were you yourself ever to marry, she is the very woman for you. This idea, which Emma tosses out in jest here, will later become an object of more serious and poignant consideration. A little foreshadowing there. Next paragraph. I have always thought it very foolish intimacy, said Mr. Knightley presently, between Harriet and Emma, though I have kept my thoughts to myself. But now I perceive that it will be a very unfortunate one for Harriet. You will puff her up with such ideas of her own beauty, of what she has to claim to, that in a little while nobody within her reach will be good enough for her. And top of page 63, men of sense, whatever you may choose to say, do not want silly wives. So let's see, there's a reference to Mrs. Goddard down at the bottom. That's what's going to happen to Harriet. She's going to end up being a permanent boarder at Mrs. Goddard's school. And then there was more, I think it's in this chapter, where they start talking about, maybe it's a little bit later. I'm on bottom of page 63 or top of 64. Nonsense, errant nonsense as ever was talked, cried Mr. Knightley. Robert Martin's manners have sense, sincerity, good humor to recommend them, and his mind has more true gentility than Harriet Smith could understand. And that next paragraph, she did not repent what she had done. She still thought herself a better judge of such a point of female right and refinement than he could be, but yet she had a sort of habitual respect for his judgment in general, which made her dislike having it so loudly against her, and to have him sitting just opposite to her in angry state was very, very disagreeable. And in the next paragraph, this concludes, your views for Harriet are best known to yourself, but as you make no secret of your love of matchmaking, he totally gets it. It is fair to suppose that views and plans and projects you have, As a friend, I shall just hint to you that if Elton is the man, I think it will be all labor in vain. Uh, let's see, what page am I on? Mid 64. Depend on it, Elton will not do. Elton is a very good sort of man, and very respectable vicar of Highbury, but not at all likely to make an imprudent match. He knows the value of a good income as well as anybody. Elton may talk sentimentally, but he will act rationally. Yikes. I am convinced that he does not mean to throw himself away. In other words, to marry somebody without money. I have heard him speak with great admiration of a large family of young ladies that his sisters are intimate with, who all have £20,000 apiece. That's a pretty decent income. What is my these are large fortunes, especially for a family with multiple daughters. The great majority of single female characters in Austen's novels have less than that, usually much less than that. Most of those who have more are sole daughters. Mr. Elton may have a connection with such a family because of his family's background in trade for mercantile families, unlike landed families who wish to pass on the family estate intact to the eldest son, were more likely to give large fortunes to all their children, including daughters. Mr. Elton may also be exaggerating the fortunes of these young ladies. So Elton's got his mind set on a couple of ladies with big fortunes. That's all he wants, because he doesn't have much. Next paragraph. I have done with matchmaking indeed, claims Emma. I could never hope to equal my own doings at Randall's. I shall leave off while I am well. So she still really is enamored of that match that she thinks she created, but it just kind of happened naturally. And then over on page 65, she talks about the dread of such a failure, after all, became the prominent uneasiness. So this is a project to her, and she doesn't want to fail the project. And once again, we see her on a larger scale being self absorbed in this process. And then we look at the top of page, or no, it's the bottom of 65. We see her interior. And it's a whole paragraph of her interior discussion with herself. He had frightened her a little about Mr. Elton, but when she considered that Mr. Knightley could not have observed him as she had done, neither with the interest nor, she must be allowed to tell herself, in spite of Mr. Knightley's pretensions. Remember how he was hovering around when Emma was making that portrait? He wasn't hovering around anybody but Emma. That he had spoken it hastily and in anger, she was able to believe. So she's talking herself into believing that she is still justified. She goes on, that he had rather said what he wished resentfully to be true, ironically, than what he knew anything about. He certainly might have heard Mr. Elton speak with more unreserve than she had ever done, and Mr. Elton may not have been an imprudent, inconsiderate disposition as to money matters. He might naturally be rather attractive than otherwise to them. But then Mr. Knightley did not make due allowance for the influence of a strong passion at war with all interested motives. She's justifying herself in spite of what Mr. Knightley had said, which appears to be quite accurate. But she saw too much of it to feel a doubt of it overcoming with any hesitation that a reasonable prudence might originally suggest. Then at the top of page 66, Harriet's cheerful look and manner established hers. She came back, not to think of Mr. Martin, but to talk of Mr. Elton. So Emma has succeeded, but we already know that Harriet is a pretty weak character. We go to the, at the bottom of page, well, it's about halfway down the page 66. Mr. Elton had been determined to go on, and had said in a very particular way indeed that he was going on business, he would not put off for any inducement in the world, and something about very enviable commission and being the bearer of something exceedingly precious. It goes on. Mr. Perry could not quite understand him, but he was very sure there must be a lady in the case. This sounded to me like the telephone game. This is what people were surmising from what Elton was saying, and they are inserting what they want, which is that he must be off to ask for her hand or some other marriage business. Okay, let's see. There's a note here. There's an allusion to a fable in the 18th century poet John Gay, the have and what is that? Oh, the hare and many friends. It is in it a bull explains to the hare that he cannot offer assistance because he is expected by his cow love, saying, "And when a lady's in the case, you know all other things give place." So that's what that reference is to a lady in this case. Chapter 9, which is page, is it really? I'm just, oh, this is a very involved chapter. I think I'm going to stop here. Apparently, I have exceeded my limit, which always happens. Um, I don't know how I'm going to ever get us to catch up, but I will. You know that mostly always happens, but sometimes it doesn't. And I will mark my page. We will begin again next week on page 67. And I hope you are enjoying this as much as I am. I hope you have a good week and enjoy happy reading. Just really enjoyable, isn't it? Okay, so we're going to start on page 67. All right, so have a good week, and I will see you shortly.